This interview is made possible by the work of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Arlington, which is funded in part by the Bishop's Lenten Appeal. We thank all who support this critical appeal and the ministries it funds. You're listening to Searching for More, a podcast of the Diocese of Arlington. On this episode, did you know that the average American will spend 5 years of his or her life using social media? Sure, it's fun, but also dangerous. Tonight, the top 3 don'ts of technology and how one of them can increase aggression in your kids. This episode's host is Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese.
Dr. Michael Horne, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Billy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we dig into some of your work, you're the Director of Clinical Services for Catholic Charities. We're going to talk about a number of different topics, one of which obviously being technology. That's the topic of your book. But first, tell us a little bit about your family, what parish you go to.
Sure. So my wife and I live in Fredericksburg. We are parishioners at St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception. We've been there since 2012. And we have 3 kids. Our son is 8, and our girls are 5 and 2. So we are woefully outnumbered, and just delightfully chasing all of them.
Very good, very good. Are you a lifelong Catholic?
I am. Yep.
So, was there a point in your upbringing where you felt like counseling, clinical services, those kinds of things became an interest?
Well, so it's interesting. I actually cradle Catholic, but really drifted away from the faith towards the end of high school and into college, and actually worked in television for a number of years. I was a radio, TV, film major at the University of Texas, and then ended up at Houston PBS. Not really practicing my faith, Catholic sort of in name, but not actually doing anything with that. And just got a real sense that as great as it was to be entertaining people, in my early 20s, I just got this sense that God was calling me to do something else, to actually help people. And that was weird to me for 2 reasons. 1, I'd worked really hard to get into TV. And 2, the idea that I was actually paying attention to anything God was saying was sort of a novelty. But I really started thinking and praying, and I thought, okay, you know what does my faith really mean to me? And really embracing that faith, I felt drawn to go and study psychology. So I moved here to the diocese to do that back in 2002, and I've been here ever since.
Very good. So you went from the world of media and communications to counseling and clinical services. So you had to go from doing a lot of talking to a lot of listening.
Basically, yes. That's right. So, I was an audio tech, so I was the guy holding the floppy sort of Muppet on a stick thing. So I did a lot of listening to stuff that really matters.
Oh, okay, very good. Not as much on air as much behind the scenes production.
Right.
So, what would you say got you interested in this kind of work, though? I mean, was there a moment, was there an individual that kind of inspired you?
It was 2 things. 1, just coming into psychology in general with the media background, I was always very aware of how much technology really affected the way that we communicated and our relationships. So that was always an interest. Academically, I did my dissertation on violent video games, so looking at how technology affects people who play games, that was something that I was interested in. But what really got me was being a parent. So when my 2-year-old son I opened my book with this story. I'll share it here. So my son and I were playing with his stuffed animals. We were doing like a pretend picnic. And he picks up this wooden banana and he sticks it up to the side of his head. And he says, "Hey, Daddy, how are you?" Well, I'm thinking, okay, banana phone, sure, why not? So I play along. So I put my thumb and my forefinger, my thumb and my pinky up to my head, and I play along, and I say, "I'm good, son. How are you? Are you having a good time?" He said, "I am. I'm having a great time." I said, "Great." And then he takes the wooden banana and he points it at me, and he says, "Daddy, say cheese." Click. I said, "Wait, what did you do?" He said, "I took your picture." And then he starts swiping his finger across the banana, and he said, "Hold on, I will text it to you." Now, what was fascinating about this is that we didn't have a smartphone at the time. My son had seen a smartphone maybe twice. He hadn't held it, and he'd seen it for maybe 10 minutes each time. So we always understand how sensitive kids are to their environment, but the recognition that kids are growing up in a tech-laden environment, and this is just what they assume is normal, was fascinating and terrifying to me at the same time. So I thought, okay, if this is how sensitive kids really are, we need to be very aware, not only as parents, but even professionally, of what's the impact, what's this going to do for kids, and what do they see as the normal God-given way to communicate.
What are some of the findings? 'Cause we've talked about on the Walk Humbly podcast in the past, the Bishop's podcast, we've talked about some of the mass shootings, and people are coming in with different solutions. They're talking about gun control, they're talking about expanding gun rights, all these things. Video games have come up in terms of the violence of video games and its impact on the understanding of reality of young people, and then whether or not that translates into action. And everyone's got an opinion, but you've done some research in that. What did your research show you?
So the body of research that's out there, and mine actually agreed with this, was that if you expose yourself to a lot of violent video games, that is going to decrease the way that you feel compassionate towards other people. It's going to increase your aggressive thoughts, aggressive feelings, sometimes aggressive behaviors, but it's not a straight one-to-one. It's not the sort of thing that if you play video games, you are going to be violent. However, if you do have certain folks who are much more sensitive to violence in general, or are more susceptible to things like that, then engaging yourself in a lot of violent gameplay isn't going to be particularly healthy, in the same way that certain kids who may be gluten-free or gluten intolerant rather shouldn't have cake. They just can't tolerate it. Their systems can't handle it. So similarly, some folks who just struggle with dealing with their own internal emotions, if they are bullied, if they have had a trauma background, they may be much more susceptible to acting out on some of the violence that they participate in, not just see on TV, but the active quality of video game violence. We always worry about what kids watch, but they're just watching it. In a video game, you're actually pushing the combination of buttons that makes the violence occur, and doing that in some cases thousands and thousands of times over and over.
So you talk about, people have maybe a predisposition that if you combine these factors, is there anything that a parent can look for if their kid is playing maybe a moderately violent game, or they want to play Call of Duty because their friends are and the parent doesn't want to make them like antisocial or seeming that way? Is there a way to know if your kid is tending toward that, or starting to have less empathy or compassion? And
I think the thing is, watch how your kid does after he or she plays games for a while. So if you play for an hour and you tell them it's time to turn the game off, and they get really upset and they're kicking over chairs saying, I don't want to stop, or I'm aggravated, or getting just too frustrated, if it seems like they are getting too agitated by playing the game, that's a pretty good indication that this might be too much for them. And we're not talking about a lengthy period of time. The research that I conducted, which is also the research that's out there, it takes about 20 minutes of gameplay to have a kid start feeling more agitated afterwards. So this isn't something that, after years and years and years you're going to see changes. You can see pretty immediate changes in a person's emotional state right away.
So what about video games where kids might have that reaction to a nonviolent video game? If they're playing old school Mario Brothers, they're not going and looking for turtles to jump on or anything like that. But is there some sort of connection between the aggressive and the lack of patience and traditional video games, or is it something that we see heightened with violent video games, or maybe it acts at a faster rate there?
There hasn't actually been a lot of research looking specifically at the difference between, say, new games compared to older games. But what's interesting is that there was a demonstration in the research that actually violent video games have been an issue all the way back since 1991, 92, when Mortal Kombat first came out. Obviously, that was a violent game, but the graphic quality isn't going to be as advanced as some of the technology that we see now. What a lot of the research has shown, though, is that it's actually not so much the level of gore on the screen. It's what's the intention? What's the intention of the player? So the first historical instance of a violent video game really causing concern was back in 1979. There was a game called Death Race, which was based on a movie called Death Race 2000. And in this video game, you had a small white block that you were navigating, trying to hit other little green blocks. Well, the little green blocks were supposed to be gremlins, and you were supposed to drive this sort of white block car over these other gremlins. And there was a lot of outcry against this of, well, why? Why are we having to drive this car over these gremlins? And again, too, we're not seeing any gore, we're not seeing any blood, but the fact that people were willingly choosing to use something to hit or inflict pain on something else was really the start of concern. You could see it again in Pac-Man. There was a pushback on Pac-Man of, why are you eating the ghosts? Why do the ghosts have to be eaten at this point? Why couldn't we just sort of push the ghost off to the side? So this is something that's been going on for, at this point, nearly 40 years.
Wow. So this is one of several topics you've addressed in your book, The Tech Talk, Strategies for Families in a Digital World. It's published by Our Sunday Visitor. Obviously, when most people write a book, they see a need, not just in the marketplace, but a need in terms of the topics not being addressed, at least in this way. What was it that you were trying to address when you wrote this book?
For me, this flowed out of a series of requests that I got to speak on specific topics. There were a lot of parishes in the diocese who said, we have parents who want to understand what's the best way that we can help our families to use social media, to incorporate video games, and to protect our families against pornography. And from those requests over a couple of years, I was developing talks that really became sort of the skeleton for this book. But all three, it was, how do we have a Catholic approach to addressing these things that are very common in our society now?
And who is the audience?
The audience for the book is anybody who's going to be involved in helping families make decisions about the way they use technology. It can be parents, it can be teenagers themselves, it can be grandparents. Teachers, I think, might gain some benefit from this too, to say, what do I actually want to use within the context of the classroom as technology gets more and more prevalent? Youth directors might see this too, of, okay, I'm seeing a lot of the kids in my youth group engaging on social media. Is that good? Is that healthy? Or do I want to use the opportunity to maybe guide them into something different? In
terms of the big picture, there's three main categories that I saw in the book. Video games were obviously a key component of it. Social media is a component of it, and then pornography is a component. And within that, you weave in a lot of theological themes and ideas, and then emotional ones. And in the first couple of chapters, you talk about the loneliness caused by technology, which is the great irony, because technology has been trumpeted since the invention of the internet, that it would interconnect us even more, that we'd be more connected, more social, and yet we've seen a regression in social attitudes, kids being less inclined to call a friend or talk to someone. They would much rather just text you. Talk a little bit about where that loneliness comes from and how people can work to overcome that.
The loneliness really is coming from the fact that we desire to be connected. We desire to have these relationships, and the way in which technology can affect the relationships can actually strip that genuine encounter away. It distances us. It removes us. Now, that's not to say that technology in general, in particular social media, is unhealthy in how we can use it for keeping relationships going. Great example. My brother and his wife moved to Tokyo about a year and a half ago. Previous to that, we didn't live in the same time zone, but we at least lived close, so we would see them fairly often. They were in New Orleans. I'm very close with him. Both of them are very close with our kids. And there was a simultaneous sort of joy for him when he got this job in Tokyo, but some concern too of, how's this going to work out? We are never, ever going to see you, or at least not see you as much as we would like to. So one of the things that we do, we'll actually go ahead and we'll FaceTime. So that way we can see whatever dogs they might be fostering. They got to meet the kid's cat after Christmas when we just got a cat. So we're able to keep the relationship going in that way. And actually, if I'm really honest, one of the nerdiest things I do is that he and I have the same board games, and he will set up his board games and I'll set up mine, and we'll sync them and play via FaceTime. It's ridiculous, but it's a great thing that we like to do, and it's something that we can do because of the technology.
That's a great idea, because it combines the practical, tangible social with the technology. That's
absolutely
neat.
But in all these cases, this is a pre-existing relationship. So the idea is that technology is a steward of the relationship, not the source of the relationship. When you have kids, teenagers in particular, who suddenly all their friends are people that they have met online, they don't have those genuine encounters, they don't have that history, then they start to feel isolated and lonely, and they don't fully understand why. Because they feel as though, I've got all these people I'm connected with, I've got all these friends, I've got this network, but there's nothing really there. There's a sociologist at MIT named Sherry Turkle, and she says that the way that technology is designed, social media particularly, it gives us the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. And the recognition that we really do have to work hard at these relationships. It's too easy just to tweet something out. It's too easy just to go and post something on somebody's Facebook page. We're not actually there with them when it matters the most.
Yeah, the investment isn't there, especially with someone that you've not met. So there creates this illusion, you're saying, of companionship when there's really not the investment that's required.
And no commitment, because as soon as something gets difficult or frustrating, I don't have time to deal with you, so I'm going to unfriend you. I'm just going to make that disappear, because as soon as the relationship seems burdensome to me, I'm not bothered. I don't want to deal with it. I just want what's easy, what's light, what's entertaining. And if that's what's driving teenagers, I have to keep everything light and I have to always be entertaining, because as soon as somebody finds me boring, as soon as somebody finds me burdensome, if there's no legitimate relationship there, why would they stay? Why would they care about me?
Does that flaw, psychological or emotional, whatever it might be, translate into pornography, and that there is this emotional detachment from this person and there's no investment in this person, and that act is reserved for marriage, where if you take it out of that, it's all about the convenience for the individual?
It's the convenience and the self-centeredness.
Yes.
It's basically reducing the other person to an object, or persons as objects, to basically say, I have no interest in your dignity. All I'm interested in is what you can do for me or how you make me feel, physically or emotionally. It's very inward focus. It's very narcissistic. It's a complete removal of the idea that relationships should be grounded in a gift of self. Healthy relationships, Christ-centered relationships, should be aimed at, what can I really do for the other person? How do I reach out and give of myself to them and have the confidence that they'll be able to receive that gift that I can give of myself?
In the chapter called RealWorld Friends, you make the observation that people put a lot less stock in the impact of what they write than what they say. And this is the evolution of the internet troll. You know, the person who goes on there and they blast somebody, they see things that are insensitive, mean, things that they might not even totally believe, but they want to stick out, they want to be noticed, so they simply say something more egregious than the person before them, and that person said something pretty egregious, so they've got to really push the line. Is there any hope that we can end the age of the internet troll and talk about the good old days when that happened and is no longer the case? I guess not the good old days, but the bad old days.
Well, so the number one thing we can do is don't get sucked in. I mean, if somebody's just, piping off with ridiculous stuff, don't feel the need to convince them of your position or the rightness of where you are coming from. If they're just going to say something ridiculous, let them say it and ignore them. It's not too dissimilar from bullying. What would we used to tell our kids, or what our parents tell us? If somebody's going to, say ridiculous things, don't respond. Because if they don't get a rise out of you, then they're going to get bored, and they're not going to say it back. Similarly, I don't think we necessarily need to read the comments boxes on pretty much everything, every article, because it's not an actual conversation. For the things that matter, we want to be able to have real conversations, not just these snippet blasts back and forth where somebody can, as you say the most ridiculous thing and assume that counts as discourse, because very clearly it's not. It's just sort of ranting in 140 characters.
Yeah. So the three themes that I mentioned before, video games, social media, and pornography, obviously one is inherently evil and destructive. That's right. Pornography. We see a rise in addictions to pornography and those kinds of things. Social media and video games are a tougher nut to crack because they're not inherently wrong, but they can be used poorly, like alcohol can. Mm-hmm. Moderate consumption, nothing wrong. Once it gets beyond that, okay, now this is where it becomes a difference. I would maybe also liken it to the difference between someone playing bingo at a senior center versus someone who's playing hardcore poker and losing their house, or their kid's college. Any of these things can be spun out of control. What is your advice for people who are trying to navigate the waters of video games and social media personally, like individuals, adults that don't know where the appropriate line is? And I don't think that maybe for adults comes up more in social media than video games, but it's there too. Mm-hmm. And how do they determine for their own life when they've crossed the line? Are there indicators that you can look for, or is there something harder, more difficult to identify?
No, there are. There are definitely indicators, and it's what's the impact on the rest of your life? Because every time we are choosing to play a video game or go on social media, we're choosing not to do something else. So if we spend an hour playing whatever, Grand Theft Auto, or an hour checking our Facebook page, that's an hour that we're not with our kids, or with our wife, or exercising. So anytime that we are finding our life just starting to get out of control in certain areas, like, okay, hang on, are my relationships healthy? Am I taking care of myself? How's my prayer life? Because we have a finite amount of time, and what we do with that time really matters. I think the idea a generation ago was, show me who you hang out with, and I'll tell you who you are. What I would say is today, show me what you spend your time doing, and I'll tell you what really matters to you. So the priorities of what we choose to do with that free time we have has a tremendous ripple effect for the rest of our life.
What would you say, most of the adults probably listening to this podcast that are trying to figure out how to deal with this at home, what is the danger in not addressing it at home? Because sometimes in the deliberation, you become paralyzed, and what's the paralysis of analysis, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So for those who are trying to figure out what to do at home, but they just find themselves continuously delaying it and putting it off, what's the danger there? The
biggest danger is that it's always easier to add things than to take things away. So if you don't make active decisions on how technology is going to be a part of your family, if we're not setting guidelines, then anything goes. And it's whatever gets brought in, or it's just, we started by really trying not to have cell phones at the table, but then I had a couple work emails, and then one of my other kids had something else they needed to do, and suddenly where are we? Well, we're just eating dinner staring at our phones. Or it's, okay, well, as long as you get all of your schoolwork done first, then you can play video games. But suddenly is it turning into not just 30 minutes, but an hour and a half, 3 hours? Or, well, it's a weekend, I don't have any homework. Can I just sit here and play for 8 hours? So it's very easy, I think, for the way we use technology to get out of hand in terms of momentum, and it just spreads everywhere if we don't really make good decisions to put parameters around it.
So I'm going to give you two scenarios, and I would like your advice.
Okay.
This sounds way more intense than it actually is, I promise. So for parents with little kids who aren't tied to technology yet, I'd consider myself in this boat. My kids, they're 4, 3, and 1, but they'll watch Netflix and they'll, do those kind of things. But they're not, getting lost into YouTube for 3 hours at a time or anything like that. For parents who have those little kids that aren't tied, what would you say to them now so they don't find themselves looking back wishing they had acted earlier?
Right. The best thing you can do, I think, parents should have conversations together to say, okay, what do we want this to look like? This is a major thing coming into our house. A similar example, we got a cat at Christmas. Now, we didn't just sort of find a cat. We didn't just kind of wake up one morning and say, hey, let's get a cat. We had a serious conversation of, okay, what's this going to look like? Who's taking care of this cat? Who's going to feed the cat? Who's going to change the litter on the cat? Financially, what's the impact of having a cat? How would we have the cat in the house? All those things had to be figured out first before we said, okay, we think our family and our kids in particular are ready to have this cat. They're not going to try to stuff them in the fridge or something like that. We feel confident that we can manage having a cat. It's not that different with technology. The only big difference I'd say actually is there's a lot more technology out there than cats. So so we have to make very prudent decisions to say, what do we want and what do we specifically want for our kids? A lot of people will come into my office and say things like, what's the right amount of TV or screen time for my kids? And I will give them a really truthful but unsatisfying answer. It depends. It depends on who your kids are. We mentioned earlier with violent video games, some kids are just more susceptible to that. Some kids can watch TV, for quite a long time and be fine. Other kids really struggle in terms of the transition from, okay, time to turn off the TV, now we're going to do something else. Or the pull of having social media is just too great that they're not getting their homework done, or they're avoiding other things that they could do, spending time with their siblings, going outside. So we've got to be aware of who are the kids God gave us. What are their temperaments? What are their strengths? Where do they struggle? And understanding that, how do we make good decisions now and try to help them make good decisions for the future? Because at some point, your kids and mine will leave the house and they will go somewhere else where we are not there to encourage them to make those good decisions. So how do we foster the ability to judge well and make good decisions as they are using that technology as adults?
So, that actually kind of segues well. So for a parent with teenagers who feel like, okay, they're going to college in just a few years and this is out of hand. They don't have as much time as the person with the 4-year-old or the 2-year-old to get this right. How would you encourage them to talk to their kids about this, since their kids have a lot more freedom? They can't just control every moment and how much TV they watch. Well, when TV's on your phone and their phone's at school and, kids are going out with their friends, you've got a lot less control there. What would you say recommend for that parent and what they might talk to their child about?
Well, the hope is that by the time our kids are teenagers, we do have a really good relationship with them and we can talk about things that genuinely concern us, not just because we like telling them what to do, but because we want the best for them. because we have a very high level of love for them, but we also have high expectations, and we want them to flourish. So really talking about what is it that we want to change? Do we like what we see in our family in terms of how we use technology? In many ways, that actually is the central question in the book, the Tech Talk, is when we look around our family, do we like what we see? And if the answer is no, what changes can we make? One thing that I recommend in the book, which is a little bit more extreme, but as we enter into Holy Week, it might not be the worst thing. To what extent can we just unplug? Can we go 2 weeks and just say, look, all right, all of us, we're not doing tablets, we're not doing TV, we're not doing phones. I'm not saying we aren't engaging in the activities we need to at work and school. I mean, you're not going to stop responding to emails from your boss and say, sorry, boss, we're unplugging now as a family. Or, I'm sorry, I can't type up this report because my dad won't let me use a laptop anymore. But saying, okay, when you take out what is essential in terms of work and school, it's all the non-essential stuff that we tend to get stuck with. So where do we make really good decisions there, and what do we replace it with? So we're not just sitting there staring at each other or the walls, but say, okay, what do we actually want to do? How do we really want to connect better? And if we make that sort of 2-week active decision, of which there'll be lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth, if we can do that, when you sort of strip things back, how do you add things in gradually? You don't just sort of jump right in, like many of us do on Easter Sunday, of just eating 3 gallons of ice cream and 1.5 pounds of chocolate and say, well, thank goodness Lent's over. But to say, how do I actually go and incorporate things differently?
So in the Tech Talk, you obviously had to do a lot of research leading up to a book like that. When you look back on the research, you knew what you were looking for in certain respect. What are some things that maybe surprised you? What did you find that you said, wow, I did not see that one coming?
I think the 3 things that surprised me, there's actually one in each area. The first, I think we all know sort of internally, pornography is not a good thing. We know pornography is not good. It's sinful. It's a problem. But I didn't realize how strongly impactful it was on the person. So if a person looks at pornography, neurotransmitters are released in their brain. Dopamine, which is related to the reward system, and norepinephrine, which is related to the arousal system. But if you do scans of the brain and analysis of those neurotransmitters, when the brain looks at pornography, it responds in the exact same way as it does when the brain is on cocaine.
Wow.
So having the neurological response to looking at pornography is the same as somebody using cocaine. So when we understand that, then we can start to get a sense of this really is a huge problem.
Well, it explains the addictive nature of it.
It does. What's terrifying, though, is that we forget that the age of average first online exposure right now is 11.
Wow.
And that the largest user of online pornography are 12 to 17-year-olds. So we have to be very, very mindful as parents of what kids have access to so that they aren't putting themselves in a position that they are frying their brains and developing all of these negative reinforced patterns as they move forward. So that was one of the first things. The second thing that surprised me was, and I knew this looking at the research for my dissertation, but going back and looking at it again, of the history of the military using video games as training software for soldiers. So the most common example of this was a program called Marine Doom, which was a slightly modified version of Doom 2, which came out in 1995.
Yeah.
And this was something that was widely popular. It was in households and dorms everywhere across the country. But the Marines actually used this to increase firing rates for their soldiers. And it was incredibly popular and incredibly effective. So the Marines, the USMC, actually found that this was an effective training tool to improve combat efficacy for their soldiers. And again, this was something that we were just
as like a tactical training tool, or for
actually
like intentional desensitization.
It was more intentional destimulation. So yeah, so basically, it's are you used to pulling the trigger when you see something, and are you used to it? Are you getting used to it falling down?
Wow.
The third and a more, well, a less sort of alarming stat than the first two. This is currently my favorite stat. When you look at the research on social media In 2017, based on the usage rates last year, the average person in the U.S. will spend 5 years and 4 months of their life on social media. Not online, not looking at computers, just on social media. 5 years, 4 months. That is the equivalent of the amount of time it would take to walk across the country 13 times.
Wow. So 5 years, 4 months, you're saying is the average.
That's the average amount of time somebody in this country will spend on social media based on usage rates last year.
So if you're using more than the average, you're looking at a decade on social media. Wow, that's really horrifying.
It's a lot. And again, too, think about this. Every hour we choose to spend on social media, we are not spending with other people or doing other things. And to our earlier conversation of social media is disconnecting, it gives us that illusion of companionship without the actual friendship element of the relationship. We're basically saying that we're going to spend 5 years and 4 months of our life alone.
Do you think that there's going to be an about face on this? Like, I almost look at it like we think of food. There was this huge wave where the frozen TV dinners and McDonald's were, it's like, this is the food of the future. This is the way we're all going to live. Well, people got tired of that. And then a group like Whole Foods can come around, and farmers markets have kind of had this resurgence. And so people want quality food. It's not just about volume. It's not just about speed and how fast can I get a meal, but it's about, is it a decent meal? Vegetarianism and veganism can survive in a culture not long after the McDonald's explosion. So it's okay. Sometimes we go through this wave and then we backtrack. And there's a sense to which I feel like people want to regress out of this technological addiction. And there was something on the news a little while back about teenagers who are starting to even separate themselves from technology. They're saying that this is too much and they're not enjoying it, so they're stepping back. And then, but then I hear recently that I was listening to a podcast, and they're talking about smart speakers and how the access to technology is only going to increase and our media consumption is going up. So like podcast consumption, well, for the effect of this podcast, I'm excited about that. But for the effect of their spiritual lives, I'm not sure how I feel. Right. The rate of how people who listen to podcasts, the amount of podcast content they're listening to is increasing by hours per week every year. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, I feel like eventually we're going to stop this, and we'll get back to consuming quality content on the internet, which is what it was really created for. People talk about the encyclopedia being there and all these things in the earliest days. Well, now that's not what people are looking at on on the internet and social media.
No, we're looking
but then
at
I find
sandwiches,
that the tools are even easier, making it even easier to access it. So where do you think, if you had to look into your crystal ball, what do you think would happen?
It's going to be challenging because I love the analogy of food, going from TV dinners and McDonald's. The challenge is there, though. When we were eating a lot of TV dinners, we didn't lose the ability to figure out how to cook. Like, we could look at a healthy recipe book and say, you know what, gosh, I feel terrible. Let me go ahead and do this. If we are primarily relying on social media for the way that we interact with people, do we then start to lose the ability to really engage in these genuine relationships? And then if we get to the point that we want them, do we know how to have them? Or is it just this void of saying, gosh, I really wish I felt more connected, and I'm just flailing about trying to figure out what's going on? It's the idea of it's very difficult to give what you never got. So if you don't have the example, it's going to be difficult. So what do we have to do? I think we have to really strengthen families. We want to get away from just our traditional notions of families of looking, good and well polished on the outside, but disjointed at home, and say, can we actually go ahead and move towards the idea of a genuinely connected family? Can we have engaged families? So not just good Catholic families. Can we have engaged Catholic families where you're actually coming home and spending time together, where you're involved in a positive and healthy way in everyone else in that family, and you're not just a collection of people sharing a mailing address living under one roof? But to say, what are we really doing together as the domestic church, as that fundamental building block of our society, to say, this is us and this is what healthy encounters, healthy relationships look like.
Before we wrap up, is there anything, any topics we haven't touched, or anything that you would want to communicate to people, whether it's about the book or just some of these topics in general?
Well, two things. One, I would encourage people to check out the book. I hope that it will start a conversation to say, do we like how we use technology in our family? Do we like how I personally use technology in my life? And if not, how do I make changes? The other thing, though, and I think this is really important, there's always hope. I've had people come up to me in giving talks about the book and just talking about social media in general. I've had people come up and say, I haven't done any of this. I haven't paid any attention to what my kids are looking at or doing, and they're 17, 19, 20. Am I a terrible parent? It's like, well, no, it's not a question of are you a terrible parent. I strongly believe that we all have the ability to change, and we all have the ability to improve things. So anytime we go into something, we want to avoid despair. We don't want to say it's too late for us and our family. We've let this go rampant for too long. The road might be tougher if you have sort of let media go unchecked for a long period of time, but there's always hope. There's always that chance that we can go and say, you know what, starting today, let's do things differently. Let's do things better. And let's really focus on one another and try to see Christ in one another.
Amen. All right, so Dr. Michael Horne, Director of Clinical Services for Catholic Charities and author of the Tech Talk Strategies for Families in a Digital World, published by Our Sunday Visitor. What is the best way for people to get a copy of the book? What would you recommend?
They can either go on to the Our Sunday Visitor website. They can also check out my website, which is theduckeffect.com.
So it's the DUCKEFFECT.com. You can find out more about the book there. You can get it from Our Sunday Visitor. And if you are interested, you can check out more of what Catholic Charities has going on at ccda.net. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Searching for More. If you enjoyed this podcast, please write a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Also, make sure you follow the Diocese and the Arlington Catholic Herald on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to our YouTube channels for regular videos that will inspire, educate, and inform you about the Catholic faith and our diocesan community.